Today we're going to be talking about how to make your fantasy and science fiction feel more realistic. We are both going to be talking about things that you should avoid that make it feel unrealistic, and things that you should do in order to make it feel realistic. So we're going to be talking, like I said, both positively and negatively about things that have been done. And not to say that you can't do these things. If I say, hey, you shouldn't do these things, it just means you shouldn't do it if you want it to feel realistic. There are plenty of books out there that their magic systems or their sci-fi systems aren't that realistic. However, that does not mean that they're any less successful. There's this piece of lint floating around my face. All right. For example, lots of the things that I'm going to mention today, I'm actually going to give examples of shows that Disney Channel has done this with, and those are incredibly popular, and people love them. Does it mean that they are hyper-realistic fantasies, though, and that if that fantasy was to exist in real life, it would make sense? Absolutely not. So just because it's popular does not necessarily mean it's good portrayal of how to make fantasy or sci-fi look realistic. So we're going to get more into that. All right. So the first thing that we're going to talk about that you should avoid if you want to make your fantasy or science fiction universe feel more realistic is to avoid logic jumps. Now let me explain what I say when I mean logic jumps. I don't mean things that aren't explained. I mean things that you do explain, but then your explanation actually makes it make less sense. So, a great example of this is actually Disney's Wizards of Waverly Place. They had this whole explanation of, well, wizards and witches have to be hidden, and therefore there can only be one magical person in the family. So everyone learns magic, but then you all have to have a test, and whoever tests the best gets the powers, right? It makes sense to a point, and then you go, wait a minute. But they still know they have magic powers, and that still means when they marry someone, they'll have to tell them about the magic powers, and that still means that their kids might have magic powers. So ultimately, that the whole only one kid can have magic powers doesn't actually make sense, because there will still be magic, they will still know about magic, and there will still be lots of people who know about magic. Excuse me? So, ultimately, when you think it through, you're like, that logic does not track at all. But this is very common in fantasy, actually, especially in middle grade fantasy or in fantasy TV shows. Now, I love Wizards of Waverly Place. I absolutely love the heck out of that show. Did it portray a realistic fantasy universe, though, that could theoretically exist in real life? No. If that existed in real life, we would know about it, and that would just be the case. End of story. You can have things be unexplained, but don't do jumps in logic where you're like, yes, this is why no one knows about it, and yet your explanation actually makes less sense than if you just didn't explain it. So, second thing that we're going to talk about is actually choosing to have it not be explained. Now, this might not make a lot of sense. You're thinking, well, Cheyenne, what the heck? If you want to have a realistic fantasy universe, you got to explain it, right? No, not necessarily. Our world is incredibly, versatile and has a lot to it and has a lot of variety, and yet there's still a lot that we don't know and cannot explain. There's still a lot in this universe that we go, that's just a theory. I have no idea what's actually going on here. Or, hey, scientists are still disproving and reproving various theories, right? Does that mean that science is real or false or true or false? Not necessarily. So I would say if you go the unexplained route, just make sure that it is unexplained in a way that they are trying to explain it. You should have people have theories. You should have people have ideas. You should have people be experimenting with it. Unless that's forbidden, in which case clarify, hey, to experiment with magic is forbidden. But there will still be people doing it, even if you forbid it. So make sure that you have theories, you have it be forbidden, you have it be something that people are curious about. Because if something is unexplained, people will want answers. There's going to be someone out there who's going to go, I don't like that doesn't have an answer, I want it explained. That doesn't mean you have to give an explanation, but at least have people who are looking at it. At least have people who are thinking about it. At least have people who want to know the answers. If you just have it be unexplained and then say, yeah, it's unexplained and no one cares to actually find out, that is not realistic either. So if you choose to have it be unexplained, just be aware that you've got to hang a lantern on the fact that no one knows. Now, hang a lantern on it is a phrase that basically means you have to acknowledge it and make it obvious to the audience. So, for example, there are a lot of sci-fi shows that do this, where they'll be like, we don't have shields right now. Oh no, what are we going to do? And they often do that because of the fact that they need to have the shields down. But then if they just say, we don't have shields, that doesn't make sense. Of course they'd have shields. So they hang a lantern on it by saying, oh no, this thing blew up and the shields are down. So that way you're aware. That's why they're not using the shields. If you just have them not use the shields, they're going to look like idiots. So, same thing with the explanation thing. If you don't have an explanation for your magic system, make sure you acknowledge that and say, yeah, no one knows how the second magic works, but a lot of people have theories. A lot of people try. It doesn't mean they understand it, but a lot of people are trying to understand it. Alright, the next best thing that you can do to make your fantasy feel realistic is make sure your magic system and or tech, if you're doing sci-fi, are explained and set up in a way that is easy for you and the reader to remember how it works. Now, the only exception for this rule is epic fantasy. If you are writing an epic fantasy, generally your world is so big and so expansive and so massive that having a few things that don't make sense are perfectly fine. Or having things that readers are like, what was that again? Is perfectly fine. For example, Brandon Sanderson, his magic system, every time that I read his books, I have to go, okay, what the frick does that do again? I don't remember. What does that do? I don't know that either. What the heck is that? And that's okay, because of the fact that it's epic fantasy. However, if you're doing anything that's not epic fantasy, generally it will feel more realistic if you have it be easy for your reader to remember how it works. Easy for them to figure out and remember, oh yeah, the this and that does this and that, and the this spell does this spell. For example, with Harry Potter, yes, she used Latin names for the spells, but she also made it so that you knew the basic spells in the beginning because they were learning them themselves. And so as a result of that, it made it so that you learned with them what everything was. And that when you didn't know a spell, she showed what it did, and therefore you knew what it was after. Whereas with Brandon Sanderson, sometimes he'll have a scene where he's just like, and they eat this random metal and do a thing, and you're like, what the heck is happening? And that's fine, but again, epic fantasy has its place, and then we have other fantasy. Now your fantasy world building can still feel incredibly realistic even if the reader doesn't understand fully how it works. For example, Brandon Sanderson. But if they don't understand fully how it works, make sure that you also have people in the universe who don't understand fully how it works. Don't have it be like, everyone knows this is basic, this is like basic math, this is just 2 plus 2. Because if it's hard enough to understand that the reader's lost, that is just going to make them feel sad and kind of a little, ouch. Some people are going to struggle with this. If it's a complex magic system, people are going to struggle. And even if it's an easy magic system, like in Harry Potter, freaking Harry and Ron struggle all the time. But we'll get back onto that in a minute. I'm talking about character struggles. If you were going to make your own creatures, now this goes for both science fiction and fantasy. In sci-fi, you have mutants and clones and androids and aliens and yada yada yada. And same thing in fantasy. Fantasy, you have magical creatures and mythical fairies and all sorts of things, right? Fantastic. Love that for world building. The only thing you gotta be careful of is that they can resemble another creature, but make sure that ultimately they aren't just a zebra painted pink and blue. You gotta make sure your creature's original. That if it looks like a zebra, you're like, oh, well, the reason it's pink and blue is because there's pink and blue grass around here. And not only that, but it actually is omnivorous, not just an herbivore. Like, you gotta have it have some spiced up qualities. You gotta have it look slightly different. You gotta have some things that are more interesting than just, I took a zebra and painted it different colors. I'm so fancy. That's not gonna feel realistic because, let's all be honest, if we went to another planet, how likely is it that we're going to have zebras just painted a different color? Not very. Sure, might we have things that are similar? Yeah, but there's a difference between similar and the same with a new coat of paint. And if you say they are like another animal, you have to be very careful about that, because if the person is, for example, like me, say I went into space and ran across a creature that looked kind of like a cat, I'd say it looks kind of like a cat. Totally fine. What feels unrealistic is when you're in a totally different fantasy universe where cats or dogs don't exist, and then they say it's like a dog. And you're like, wait, but dogs don't exist. How would you know that it looks like a dog? Your character would have no idea that it looks like a dog. That's where you run into problems. And if dogs do exist in that universe, you've got to explain, hey, why the heck is there a fantasy universe where dogs exist, but also there's this other creature that's kind of like a dog, but not? Why do they both exist? That seems superfluous, right? Or is it just a different breed of dog because it's a fantasy universe? You got to make more sense out of it. Make sure that your creatures also make sense within the universe. For example, if you are going to have a pink and blue zebra, make sure that there's a reason it's pink and blue. You're not just like, the grass is all green, but it's pink and blue. Well, that's a terrible survival instinct if I've ever seen one. That zebra would be dead in 3 minutes, probably less. So if you have a pink and blue zebra, make sure you have where it lives be full of pink and blue coral, or pink and blue trees, or pink and blue grass and plants. Have it make sense survival-wise as well. Can you have cool creatures that just look cool? Yes, 100% you can do that. Just know that your fantasy will not be as high realistic, and that's okay. You can totally just accept, hey, my fantasy is not realistic, it's just fun. And just go with it. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you want it to feel realistic, if you want your reader to feel like this place could theoretically exist in real life, this is something that you need to take into account. All right. Next thing that you're going to want to think about, if you're going to make your own tech, do a little research, but also feel free to make up stuff based on what currently exists. A great example of this is Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. He has a contraption that he calls seashells. Basically, the way he describes it is a little radio that goes in your ear so you can hear the radio playing. At the time, Bluetooth and AirPods didn't exist. He was making this up based on the fact that he was like, well, if radios exist, eventually we'll get them small enough to put in our ears. Genius. True, also. It worked. It's true. But that didn't exist at the time. So what he did is he took a current tech invention and then said, okay, what's the next logical step? And I would say take 1 or 2 logical steps. If you go 3, 4 logical steps ahead, you'll probably get it wrong, and then people will feel weird when they're like, that doesn't actually exist, or that doesn't make sense. So don't go too far, otherwise people feel it's too unrealistic. But if you go just 1 or 2 steps ahead of where our current technology is, I think you'll find some great ideas for science fiction technology. And you can always do more research, saying like, hey, what do we currently have that people think in 4 or 5 years could be integrated into society better? What do we currently have that is biochemical that in 4 or 5 years could change the world? Things like that can definitely help influence your science fiction and the way you write, and actually make it feel more realistic for the readers. Because, for example, with Fahrenheit 451, people read that and went, you know what? I bet radios could be small enough to fit in your ear one day. And it just made sense. Things like that generally, even if they don't make sense for everyone at the time, people can see the logic. Like I said, as long as you don't take it too far, they can see the logic, and they're like, okay, I could see that being realistic. I could see that happening. And then on top of that, it's also cool because then if you do predict it, you can always be like, haha, I predicted the thing. But that's generally not why we're here. We're here to create a fun story that just so happens to have some cool technology in it with science fiction. If you're going with interplanetary space travel, I will say, because of the fact that we haven't actually done any finding of other aliens on planets yet, that is uncharted territory. In order to make it feel realistic, just make sure that you follow, like I said, basic principles of survival and things like that, Make sure your animals could actually, survive on said planet that you create. Don't have a desert planet with a bunch of water creatures. That's not going to make a lot of sense.
Utah!
Yeah, don't have a desert planet with sky whales unless the sky whales somehow can float in the denser gas. Yeah, you gotta make it make sense. So we're talking about making things more realistic in science fiction and fantasy. So
We shall return.
okay, sounds great.
Yeah.
All right. Now this might sound like a little bit off topic, but make sure that you stick to what you're passionate about. If you start getting bogged down in the world building to the point where you're like, I have to make sure my fantasy system's perfect, or I have to make sure my science fiction system's perfect, you could get stuck, for sure. You could definitely get stuck. And that's okay. It's okay to feel stuck. It's okay to need help. However, the problem happens when you're constantly world building and never moving forward. If you're struggling to move forward because you're world building too much, I would say just write your story, and then if you want to go back and be like, my fantasy world building's a little unrealistic, you can fix that later.
Fix it in post.
Exactly. Yes, should you world build a little bit beforehand? Absolutely, but don't let the world building take over your life. There's a fine line. I would say if you've done at least a week to 2 weeks equivalent, so like let's say you work on it 2 hours every day, if you've done a week to 2 weeks equivalent of working on your world building, that is more than enough. You need to cut yourself off from your drug and be done. Your world building needs to be put on the back burner, and you need to start writing. So yeah, make sure that you stick to what you're passionate about. Don't let yourself get stuck in the details and the nitty-gritty. Even though the details and nitty-gritty are important to making a fully polished story that can be published, it also means that you sometimes get stuck and you'd rather have a finished product and fix it in post, like Gwen was just saying. All right, next thing we're going to talk about is, for science fiction specifically, make sure that you don't list the year that things are happening, unless you list it in another number format. Same thing with fantasy stories that take place in the modern world. It actually throws people off if you say, hey, this book takes place in 2020. Then people go, and they start looking at you funny. Like if you, like for example, Harry Potter. Technically Harry Potter takes place in I think 2005. But if you say that, people look at you like, it feels wrong. Exactly, it feels wrong.
Does not feel right.
It feels wrong. If you read it, then you realize, oh, there's no phones. So clearly it has to take place sometime in the 2000s, right?
Yeah.
But that your brain naturally fills that in. Your brain naturally fills that in. You don't need to punch the readers in the face with the date and go, boom, this is the year. That actually is throwing them off. Unless you need it.
Which actually be really cool.
True, but in that case, I would say if you're doing a science fiction captain's log, make sure that you do it in a year set that doesn't exist yet. For example, with Marissa Meyer's Cinder, she does that, where she's like, this is the year 2006, but she just says EA. We have no idea what EA is. We have no clue. But that's why it works, is because that could be 4,000 years in the future, that could be 2 years in the future, we don't know. Whereas if you say this will take place in 2015, and then 2015 comes and goes, that's awkward.
The whole Back to the Future thing.
Right?
2015 came and went. Hoverboards are still not a thing.
Exactly, and that's what makes it so weird. We were like, oh, well, that was okay, you know. And so,
those weird Nikes.
right, all the weird things. It makes it feel awkward, right? Whereas if they had just said sometime in the future, we might have been more accepting, right? Same thing with, like I said, realistic fantasy. If you're doing something that takes place in the modern day, we do not need to know the year. Or this even goes for realistic fiction. Even if you're not writing fantasy, not writing sci-fi, if you're writing a realistic fiction novel that takes place in 2020, we don't need to know it's 2020. We see masks and we'll know it's 2020.
Yeah, and everyone and their mother is freaking out about coronavirus. It's 2020. We all know.
Exactly. We all know that. You don't have to punch us in the face with date. Or if it's in 2023, you don't have to tell us it's 2023 unless there's this like specific event. And even then, all you have to do is, hey, they say, hey, this specific election is going on, and then our brain goes, oh, that's 2023. Exactly. See, like we're like, yes, that. And so if it's important historically, then I'd say go for it. If you're writing historical fiction, then go for it. But if you're writing anything that takes place anywhere near your current modern day setting, don't mention it. And if you're doing science fiction, make sure to change the year to something that doesn't make sense in our current chronological timeline, because then we can imagine it as however far in the universe we want it to be. And then people don't have to stress over, oh, they said it happened in 70 years from now, and 70 years have passed. Guess that book was wrong. You know, that's not interesting. It's kind of like Fahrenheit 451. He doesn't say how far in the future that is. Ever. Which makes it so that Ray Bradbury, his book is able to last the test of time because of the fact that he's not predicting when things would happen. He just said, in the future, maybe this could be a thing. Period. At any time. There is no specific time limit. It's like a ticking time bomb the second you put a date at the beginning of your novel. If you need a date, I would say, and it's in modern time, use month and day. Don't use year.
Yeah.
So, if, for example, if you're like, hey, this happened in July, and then I'm going to skip forward and have things happen in August, you can do July and then August. But don't do July 2023 and then August 2023. We don't need to know that. We just know it's a month later.
Yeah.
All right. Anyway, so that will help you actually feel more realistic. All right. The next thing that you need to be careful of with making science fiction and fantasy feel realistic is copyright. Now that sounds weird because you're like, if I'm borrowing from someone else and they made it feel real, then why can't I use it? Well, copyright. If you have heard it in a movie, seen it in a book, or heard of it vaguely from another book, don't use it. In general. Or if there's something too close to it, don't use it. For example, there are certain things that are in the public domain, like elves, unicorns, things like that. But then there are other things that are not in the public domain. For example, with Dungeons and Dragons, tieflings is their own creation. You technically can't use those. Those are copyrighted.
You can make your own human-demon hybrid, though.
Oh, absolutely, you
But
can make your own
also
human-demon
can't
hybrid.
wait
But you
for
cannot call them tieflings, and they cannot look the way they do in D&D.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. And that'll actually make it feel less realistic because they'll feel like, oh, you're just copying so-and-so.
Yeah.
And so it's important to be careful of that copyright issue.
Originality is going to be your best friend.
Amen! Great point to that, Gwen. Originality is always your best friend. Absolutely. And if you find things that you're inspired by and like, hey, I want to do something like that, just make sure you make it your own. You say, hey, I like this idea. Now how do I make it better? How do I make it cooler? How do I make it mine?
Brandon Sanders is basically said not better and cooler because it's already perfect.
You're like, but it's already cool, but...
Yeah, it's fitting my brand.
But yeah, you gotta figure out what inspires you, but you also gotta figure out how to make it yours. There's a fine line between that. Also, songs. Any songs that are copyrighted, you gotta make sure that you're careful with that. Especially if songs that come from movies. If it is a historical fiction movie, you gotta Google whether or not that song actually existed before the movie. Because sometimes they will. Sometimes they'll use songs that are like, hey, yeah, this absolutely is in the public domain because this has been a sea shanty for 5,000 years or whatever.
I love sea shanties.
Exactly.
They're the best, and include them in your book, and I will be so happy.
Exactly. But you also got to be careful because a lot of people think that the things like in Pirates of the Caribbean are all public domain. That is not true.
No.
Half of that stuff was made on site for that movie.
Yeah, same with Longest Johns. Like, they have a couple of classic sea shanties, but like most of them is original work.
Most of them is
And
original
they're
work.
so good. This
They
is
are,
Longest
exactly.
Johns, you guys.
You want to use them because you're like, oh, it's cute, beautiful, but you also can't
Yes,
because
yes,
it
so
is
good.
not in the public domain. So I would say always, if you're worried about something being in the public domain, Google it first. Make sure you Google it. And if anywhere you're finding sites that say pay to get the rights to use this music, that means it is not in the public domain. In case that's confusing, just figured I should clear the air on that one. All right. Next thing that I want to talk about is magic or technology that feels like they have no rules. That is a one-way ticket to feeling like it's unrealistic. Can you do it? 100%. There's plenty of shows that have magic systems that feel like they have no rules, and technology that feel like they have no limits. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it will feel realistic. Just because the fact that you can do it doesn't mean you should necessarily do it. But that's up to you.
You're telling my brothers that. Just because you can doesn't mean
you should. Good rule for life. But yeah, so same thing with magic and technology. You can absolutely create an all-powerful weapon that can do anything and can be indestructible, 100%. But your readers are immediately going to put the book down if they feel like they were going for a realistic science fiction. If they're going for a science fiction that like half of it doesn't make any sense, by all means, go for it. But if you're going for a science fiction that up until now felt perfectly realistic, and then all of a sudden you throw this curveball at them, they're going to go, I'm not sure how I feel about this.
Establish your theme from the beginning.
Exactly. If your theme from the beginning is this tech has become so powerful you can't destroy it, establish that. From page 1, maybe 2 if you're going to really stretch it. Same thing with magic. If your magic has almost no rules or doesn't make a lot of sense or has a lot of confusing bits and bobs to it, that you're just like, oh, I use this in this scene, but then I do the same spell with these components, and those are totally different things. That's fine. But again, establish that from the beginning. However, if you're looking for realism, because that's what we're talking about today is realism, make sure that it has rules. Magic systems with rules and technology with rules just make sense to us, right?
Yep.
Because the universe has rules.
All about those rules, baby.
Gravity is a rule of life, last time I checked.
Gosh darn it, gravity. You're keeping me down. Come on.
And then you have rules of life like physics, and rules of life like chemistry, and rules of life, I could go on and on. There's a reason why we like technology to have rules.
And people study it, it has rules.
Yep. And then even things we don't understand have rules, right? There's a lot of things like with the bumblebee thing, they have actually proven that bumblebees can fly and that it makes perfect sense. But back then they used to say the whole quote, bumblebees actually couldn't fly, but they supposedly by all standards, still do, even though scientists don't, say they can't. And it's like, that's actually wrong. They've proved that those scientists were full of crap and that they actually can fly by real physics, just not physics they understood at the time. And that's totally fine. You can do things like that in your magic universe, but you gotta establish, hey, we're trying to figure this out. We just don't know yet. There are still rules to how it works, though, even if the characters don't know how it works. You could have a random street orphan who's like, I have no idea how magic works, but I use it anyway. And that's totally acceptable.
Actually, I was like, so I know that this thing works. Like, I know the mechanisms, what works, what doesn't. I don't know the theory behind it, though.
Exactly. If you told me why, like, for example, the proof, you can technically prove why 2 + 2 = 2. And it's like some insane giant math equation. Do I know it? Absolutely not. But I know that 2 + 2 = 4.
2 + 2 = 4.
Exactly.
It's easy.
It's easy, but then you can technically prove it if you wanted to. It's literally, it's
That's
this insane
so
wild.
though.
Yeah, it's wild. Anyway, long story short, with magic, you have to have rules if you want it to feel real. And with technology, you have to have rules in order for it to feel real. You have to have weaknesses. You have to have strengths. You have to have limits. You have to have why one thing works and why one thing doesn't work. But in order to have all of that, you got to make sure that you build it beforehand. Again, the characters don't have to know any of this, but you do have to know it.
Yeah.
And if you don't know it now, that's fine. Like I said earlier, don't let world building get in the way. Write your story, but then afterwards, reread it, reevaluate it, and go, okay, so I wrote this story. Now, why does half of it not make sense? And rework it. You can always revamp a story. So definitely knowing it beforehand can be helpful, but if you don't, that's okay too. Exactly. I am an editor for a reason. Thank you. This is literally my job. You don't need to stress too much over it because I'm the one who stresses over it. It's my job. But anyway, thank you. I appreciate it.
Figure outer.
I'm the one who's supposed to go, that plot hole, not you. So don't worry about it. All right, So the final thing that we're going to talk about today to making your magic/science fiction feel real is, this is a pet peeve of mine. There have been stories and there have been TV shows and there have been all sorts of different things that do this method. 100% they do. So that doesn't mean you'll fail if you do this in your novel. Just know that a lot of readers really don't like this. And this is when they learn to use magic in less than 2 minutes. Or learn to use the technology in less than 2 minutes. I don't know about you, but generally when someone plops me down with a new kind of tech or a new kind of thing to teach me, I'm not like, I get it now. I'm generally like, okay, say that again.
Yeah,
wait a minute.
If you give the instructions in a couple of hours, I'm a pro.
Exactly, like a couple of hours even. What really bothers me is when they're like, oh yeah, 2 minutes, 10 minutes, I got you. And it's like, nah, you gotta have that try-fail cycle.
Give me a low, you got me.
And even then, like, you're gonna have moments where it's like, I thought I understood it, and then I don't. If you want to have a moment like that where they're like, I totally got my superpowers worked out, and then they absolutely and biff it, 100%, that's funny.
Yeah.
But
Chef's kiss, my friend, do it.
Exactly. But if you just are like 10 minutes and now they are professional superstar, again, you can do it. But a lot of readers, this is very much like the reason why is because it's called a Mary Sue or Marty Stew.
Oh, I hate those.
Yes, and there's a reason why. Why? Because they are perfect and glamorous, and I have no flaws, and we all just want to punch them in the face. And
every single girl in my
it bothers. It bothers us because we're all like, okay, we're all human, and even if you're not human, like you're some sort of fancy elf, you still have flaws, right? Legolas from Lord of the Rings, he still has flaws. Yes, he's supposed to be high and mighty elf, but he still has issues. Just
even
because
if they're not human, they are human.
Exactly.
Humans have flaws.
And we relate to them because they have flaws and they have
It's
issues.
just such a good story. It's just so.
So, if you're going to write a character that is proficient at something, make sure that they've practiced a lot beforehand. So, for example, if you have someone who is, say, a really good hacker, make sure that you establish they've been working on their hacking skills for 10 to 15 years. Don't have them be like, hey, I'm a professional hacker now in 2 minutes. Not how that works. As someone who has people who have tried to be professional hackers as friends and family, that is not how that works. Even the best computer people struggle. So, long story short, magic powers and science fiction tech are going to take work to understand. Even if you're, one of those people who just has talent, talent only takes you so far before you trip and fall.
Yeah.
And that's what makes them feel more realistic and less like a Marty Stew or a Mary Sue. It makes them feel less overpowered and less like, oh, I'm perfect. Another thing, just a side note, doesn't have to do with magic or sci-fi, but it does have to do with Marty Stew and Mary Sue. If you want to avoid the Marty Stew, Mary Sue thing, make sure that for everything they have that they're perfect at, they have something else that they really suck at. I don't mean just kind of suck at, I mean like abysmally suck at.
Yeah.
Because you gotta have those counterbalances, you gotta have those weights.
If
you have one thing...
No, you don't. You're
yes,
wrong.
I do!
No,
Michael! Shush.
Yeah, see?
Okay, both of you. I love you both dearly, but all right. So, with creating perfect characters, you got to make sure you have balances. Otherwise, they will always feel obnoxious. Characters who are perfect at things are not. Characters who are perfect at things is not necessarily the issue. The issue is having no flaws. The issue is having flaws that are also not compensating. So like I said, if they're perfect at this one thing, and then their only flaw is that they have acne,
ew,
that's not going to compensate.
No,
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's fine if you want to do that, but have it be like, they're perfectly gorgeous, but then have acne. That's more of a reasonable thing that works.
Acne?
Oh my gosh, that would, ooh man, that would be great. So
that was
like born of Aphrodite, but also struggles with acne. Wow, that is a character in itself right there. I need this now. That would be so heckin' relatable. Like if I could just clear up this acne, I might actually look attractive, but I can't get it off my face. Like it's rough. It's rough. People struggle with that. That is something realistic that teens struggle with. I don't know about you, but throughout all my high school years, it was a struggle. It's hard. It is very hard. Anyway, long story short, you gotta make sure that your perfection and your imperfection.
I will break your arm.
Make sure that your perfection and your imperfections match up. So again, if they have something super cool, like for example, they're the best at magic in their class, make sure that they also have a equal
suck
issue.
at public speaking.
Exactly.
They are socially awkward.
Exactly.
They're nerds. I love nerds.
You got to make sure that they have a balancing thing to them. For example,
nerds.
part of the reason why Captain Marvel, the movie, bothered everyone is because of the fact that her only flaw was the fact that she had a slight temper. That's not really compensating for the amount of power she has. She has unlimited power, and her only issue is I throw a tantrum. That's not an issue.
Major anger issues and
Exactly.
like the kind of the character arc is like kind of controlling. Yeah,
exactly.
It's like if the character arc is controlling your anger, like that is a fine story, my friend. Please write that.
But then ultimately, her flaw was she has tantrums, and then the solution to her powers was to have a bigger tantrum. And it's like that is not a character arc. That is an issue.
That's a rut.
Exactly, that's a problem, not a solution. But anyway, so long story short.
No.
Shh. So long story short, make sure that your abilities and cool powers are compensated by appropriate problems. Does anyone have questions for making your fantasy universe or science fiction universe feel more realistic? Less problems. No? We're all good? Okay, then I will turn off the video and pray that you guys don't stab each other.
Well, don't worry.
Shh, it's fine.
It's an everyday occurrence.
Anyway, alright, I'm going to turn off the video.